Have you ever stood next to someone you love deeply and felt completely alone? Like you're physically present, but emotionally invisible. You're in the same room, sharing the same air, but the intimacy is gone. The connection feels more like memory than reality. And still, you wait hoping, wondering, wanting something, anything, to make sense of what's slipping away. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." In times like these, that quote becomes more than just an idea, it becomes survival. When someone begins to withdraw from us, the pain we feel doesn't always come from their absence. It comes from our resistance to their absence, from our inability to accept what's already changing. We try to grip tightly to the version of love we knew, even as it begins to dissolve. Today, I want to explore a truth that most people avoid because of how much it hurts. When love begins to leave, it always shows itself in three subtle, unmistakable ways, not loud, not cruel, but clear, if you are willing to open your eyes and see it. Let me tell you about David and Margaret's love story. David met Margaret in 1994 at a quiet church potluck in Atlanta. She wore a pale blue dress. He stood awkwardly by the snack table, holding a plate of warm bread, too shy to speak. 2 years later, they married, bought a modest home in the suburbs, raised 2 boys, and adopted a golden retriever named Max. Their life wasn't perfect, but they moved like a team, supporting each other, sharing burdens, creating memories that felt, at one time, unbreakable. But then came year 30, and without warning, the love began to evaporate, not in loud arguments or betrayals, but in absence, avoidance, and quiet emotional distance. Margaret started speaking less. David stopped asking. They weren't fighting, they were drifting. This is the tragedy of many long-term relationships. Love doesn't die in chaos. It starves slowly in silence. Stoicism teaches us to notice what's within our control and to act while the bond is still alive, because sometimes saving a relationship isn't about passion, but about presence. Now we come to the first sign, silent emotional withdrawal. Margaret still made dinner. She still went to church. She still sat beside David at the end of the day, nodded at his stories, and kept the house running the way she always had. From the outside, everything looked the same. But David began to notice something different, something quieter than change, but more unsettling. There was a shift in the air between them, like standing in a familiar room where someone had moved the furniture an inch at a time, so gradually that it made you question your memory. Gone were the small gestures, the gentle squeeze of her hand during their evening walks, the soft questions that used to arrive without prompting. Did you sleep okay? Or, you seem off today, want to talk? The warmth wasn't gone in a blaze. It had faded in silence. And the silence itself had become the loudest part of their lives. He first felt it on a Tuesday evening, nothing special about it. He had just finished telling a light-hearted story from work, the kind that would usually earn a laugh. But Margaret only smiled a brief, courteous smile and returned to slicing apples in the kitchen. That smile wasn't cruel. It wasn't cold. It was distant. She was there, physically present, but emotionally out of reach. And in that instant, David understood something he had never had the language for before. Someone can sit right next to you and still be gone. This is how love fades after decades. It doesn't fall apart in one terrible moment. It unravels in silence, one unspoken feeling at a time, one gesture that's no longer offered, one emotional absence that goes unacknowledged. There is no shouting, no breaking of vows, just a quiet and consistent turning away. What makes this so difficult, especially for people who've been married for 30, 40 years, is that the habits of life continue. The bills get paid, the grandchildren come to visit, the anniversaries are marked on the calendar. but the center has gone hollow. It's like keeping a house standing long after the fireplace has gone cold. And the hardest part, most people don't even notice until it's too late. David had spent years doing what he thought was right. He was dependable. He showed up. He didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't abandon her. He worked hard, built a life provided. But in doing all the big things, he missed the small ones. He had confused loyalty with connection. He thought showing up was enough. And maybe it was, for a while. But Margaret had been slowly retreating not because she wanted to leave, but because she was tired of being unseen. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes in later life. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being with someone who no longer sees you. The tragedy isn't that Margaret stopped loving David. It's that she had nowhere to bring her feelings, no place where her inner world would be met with curiosity or care. So she withdrew quietly, with grace. And that grace is what made it so easy to miss. Stoic philosophy doesn't romanticize love. It doesn't promise rescue or reunion. What it offers is clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You can stand upright even in the storm if your mind remains unaffected." But here's the truth. In relationships, we are always affected. We're human. But we can learn to see more clearly, to stay awake, to act before the final moment has passed. For David, that moment in the kitchen, the polite smile, the way she didn't really laugh, was a gift wrapped in discomfort. It was a moment of vision. He saw that love isn't something you lose in one moment. It's something you stop attending to, one quiet day at a time. He saw that Margaret wasn't angry. She wasn't resentful. She was just far away and had been for a while. The question then isn't just, what happened to us? But when did I stop noticing? We like to believe that love in old age is a reward, that if we stick it out long enough, if we raise the children and pay the mortgage and survive the storms, we'll arrive at some kind of emotional retirement. But that's not how it works. Love doesn't accumulate interest. It requires effort until the very end. And when that effort stops, so does the intimacy. The Stoics would say, control what you can. And in this case, that means learning to see the emotional world of the person beside you. It means asking the questions you stopped asking years ago. It means listening, even when the answers feel difficult. Because if you wait too long, what you'll be left with is the memory of who someone used to be, sitting beside a version of them you no longer understand. David didn't need to beg for love. He needed to wake up to it. And so do we, especially those of us who think time is enough. It's not. Presence is. Intention is. Attention is. Because sometimes the worst kind of heartbreak is the kind that never even raises its voice. Second sign, criticism under normal cover. David had never been much of a cook. That was always the running joke between him and Margaret. Years ago, she used to laugh and say he was the best chef among their 3 dogs' kind, teasing, warm, affectionate in the way that long-married couples could afford to be. It wasn't about the cooking. It was about the closeness, about having someone who could laugh at your flaws and still reach for your hand across the dinner table. But over time, the jokes changed. They lost their warmth. The smile no longer reached her eyes. Margaret still commented on the way he cooked, but now her voice held something sharper. She started pointing out how he left things out on the counter, how he forgot where the spatula went, how he stirred too fast or seasoned too little. It was subtle at first, passing remarks during quiet evenings, but soon the tone shifted. The teasing felt more like criticism, and the criticism no longer felt like love. David began to hear it everywhere, not just in the kitchen. She would mention how he left his shoes by the door, like a child. She'd correct him during conversations as if he couldn't finish a sentence without stumbling. She'd sigh when he offered a suggestion, as though she had already predicted it would be wrong. And he didn't fight back. He didn't snap. He thought maybe she was tired. Maybe it was the stress. He didn't want to create conflict where there had always been peace. But deep inside, something had begun to shift, not just in her, but in him too. What once had been jokes between equals now felt like judgments from a distance. Margaret wasn't yelling. She wasn't cruel. But the way she spoke measured, cool, detached, carried a weight that didn't exist before. Her words weren't laced with malice, but they were no longer rooted in affection either. And that's what made them hurt the most. For older couples, this transformation is often so slow, so disguised in routine, that it's easy to overlook until it becomes undeniable. The years have a way of piling up unspoken frustrations, accumulated disappointments that no one names out loud. What once was endearing now becomes irritating. What once was forgiven easily now becomes ammunition. Over time, unresolved emotion seeps into the language of everyday life. Resentment doesn't always show up as anger. Sometimes it shows up as indifference cloaked in politeness, other times as sarcasm or passive disapproval hidden beneath a smile. That's how emotional distance grows through the words we pretend don't mean anything. David, in his quiet way, absorbed it all. He didn't want to argue. He thought letting things slide was the loving thing to do. But something in him began to ache not from the words themselves, but from what they implied. He started to feel small in his own home, like a guest overstaying his welcome. He realized that Margaret was no longer seeing him as her partner. She had begun to see him as an inconvenience, not because she said it out loud, but because it was written in the pauses, in the tones, in the way her eyes looked past him during dinner. There's a psychological truth here that's hard to accept. When love begins to sour in long-term relationships, it doesn't always do so with cruelty. Sometimes it transforms into a kind of quiet disapproval, a daily judgment that goes unspoken, but never unnoticed. Margaret didn't wake up one day and decide to be cold. Her criticism was likely rooted in her own quiet dissatisfaction, years of things unsaid, needs unmet, emotions dulled by routine. But instead of reaching toward David, she began turning away, guarding her feelings with distance and detachment. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, once said, "It is not the things themselves that disturb us, but the interpretations we place upon them." For a long time, David tried to remember that. He reminded himself not to take her words too personally, that perhaps her frustrations were more about her than about him. But Stoicism also teaches us to see clearly, to face what is without softening it. And the truth was, her words were no longer a reflection of love. They had become a quiet form of rejection. What David came to understand, painfully slowly, is that when someone begins to lose their emotional investment in you, the first sign is often in their speech, not in shouting, but in the disappearance of gentleness, the loss of effort, the refusal to cushion feedback with kindness. It's not always what they say, it's how they say it, and why they no longer care to say it with care. But Stoic wisdom doesn't encourage wallowing in grief. It calls for acceptance, for clarity, for action, not dramatic confrontation, but conscious recognition. David began to realize that he couldn't change Margaret's tone. He couldn't reach back into the past and erase whatever disappointments had hardened her. But he could change the way he showed up in the relationship. He could reclaim his dignity, not through pride or ego, but through presence. He could choose to be fully himself, even if she had stopped seeing him clearly. For many in late adulthood, this realization is brutal, that longevity doesn't guarantee intimacy. Time alone is not proof of love's survival. Sometimes it merely extends the timeline of slow emotional withdrawal. But if we are awake, if we are honest, we can still salvage something, not always the relationship as it once was, but the self-respect and peace that comes from living in truth. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't make demands. But he began to look Margaret in the eye again, not to challenge her, but to be seen. He began to speak more clearly, to express his feelings not with blame, but with honesty. And in doing so, he stopped shrinking inside the marriage. He began to exist again, not as someone waiting for kindness, but as someone who had found his voice, even in the silence. Sometimes the most painful part of growing old together is realizing how far you've drifted apart while still sitting at the same table. But if you are willing to see it, if you stop pretending not to notice, it's still possible to turn toward each other again, or, at the very least, to turn toward yourself. And that, too, is a kind of love worth honoring. If you found these insights valuable, let me know by commenting yes below. Your thoughts matter, and I'd love to hear from you. Third sign, the slow forgetting of why you began. David learned through that silence that love doesn't always leave with noise. Sometimes it simply fades, like light at the end of a long day. And Stoicism helped him name that feeling, not to escape it, but to face it with courage. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That night, in the dark, David didn't argue with what he felt. He didn't chase for reassurance. He let the truth settle. It was painful, but it was real. And that made all the difference. Stoicism doesn't ask us to suppress emotion. It asks us to examine it, to understand where we place our expectations and how we react when those expectations go unmet. David realized that he had clung too tightly to the image of their marriage, the version of it that once was, rather than what it had become. And in doing so, he had blinded himself to the emotional vacancy that had grown between them. But this isn't a story of resignation. It's a story of awakening. Because once you see the truth of what a relationship has become, you're free to respond not with bitterness, but with intention. David didn't leave Margaret. He didn't offer more. But he began to live differently within that truth. He stopped waiting for signs of affection and started reconnecting with his own sense of value. He sought out moments of presence, not to fix her, but to find himself again in the absence of her gaze. He learned to see himself more clearly. This is a hard lesson, especially for those who've spent their lives loving deeply. The absence of love does not always mean failure. It means the conditions have changed. People evolve, hearts grow tired. And sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to acknowledge the emotional silence, not run from it, not dramatize it, but sit with it and decide who we want to be inside of it. For David, that night in the dark was the beginning of something, not a new romance, not a restoration of the old, but a return to his own inner stillness, a place where he could say, "This is what is, and I will meet it with dignity." Because, in the end, when love withdraws, it does not always mean the story ends. But it does mean the story has changed. And the only question that remains is how you choose to live in the space that silence leaves behind. Love is not a habit. It is a choice, one that must be made again and again, especially in the quiet years when routine begins to replace romance and affection turns into obligation. The Stoics never taught us to cling to what is fading. They didn't romanticize endurance for its own sake. What they taught was observation, acceptance, and then action guided not by emotion, but by clarity. David came to understand this in the final season of his marriage, when the silence between him and Margaret had grown long and heavy. He didn't blame her, and in time, he stopped blaming himself. What he saw was something more sobering. Love doesn't die because of a single mistake or a moment of weakness. It dies when two people stop choosing each other, when kindness is no longer offered freely, but handed out like a duty, when a kiss on the forehead becomes a ritual, not a gesture. He realized that the absence of love is not always the result of cruelty. Sometimes it's simply the slow forgetting of why you began. And in that moment, David didn't rush to fix things. He didn't demand explanations. What he did was sit down with a pen and paper and write a letter not to win her back, but to remember the truth, to say, in his own way, I still see you. I still remember who we were. And if some part of you still wants to be seen, I am still here. This is the Stoic response to heartbreak, not retreat, not resentment, but presence to love consciously, even when it no longer feels easy, to choose dignity over desperation. David did not expect a grand transformation, but by acting from awareness, not fear, he reclaimed his place in the story, not as a victim of fading love, but as a man who still chose to care, even in the silence. And in the end, that is what love becomes. Not fireworks, but presence, not perfection, but willingness, a quiet strength that says, I will not chase what is gone, but I will stand still in case it wants to return. One day, in every relationship, you'll see the signs. The emotional connection goes quiet. The words turn sharp. Even when they sound soft, they're still beside you, but their soul is already somewhere else. And in that moment, you face a choice. You can chase the shadow of the love that used to be, hold on to the habits, the routines, the presence without the presence. Or you can turn inward and hold yourself with clarity, with grace, with the quiet strength of someone who knows they are still whole, even when someone else forgets to choose them. Stoic philosophy doesn't tell us to beg or to blame. It teaches us to see, to accept, and then to act not out of fear, but from wisdom. So, if you're here right now, if you felt this ache, you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Whether you choose to stay or to walk away, do it with your eyes open, your heart honest, and your self-worth intact. Because, in the end, the deepest act of love is the one you give to yourself. If this video spoke to something inside you, I'd love to have you with us. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay close. We're building a space where silence becomes strength and clarity becomes freedom. You deserve that. You always have.